You're traveling through the fog, and just ahead is an island of mermaids, miracles, and monsters. Your next stop, Newfoundland, and these are its strange truths and tall tales. When nights grow long and familiar paths suddenly lead you astray, when fog shrouds the coast in deathly gloom and strange lights flicker in empty bogs, that's the time when ghosts and ghouls explore this newfound land. Welcome, foolish listener, to a Halloween bonus episode of the Strange Truths and Tall Tales podcast. I'm Robert, your host for a brief journey into a creepy chapter of Newfoundland's past. Tonight, I'm bringing you a folktale about a mysterious black stag that showed up along the roadside in St. Bride's. Soon after, there were a series of unexplained deaths. Was the stag to blame? The only people who know are in no state to tell us. Here it is, the folktale, The Black Stag of St. Bride's. It was 1804, and Thomas Conway's life was governed by the seasons. There was a different job for every month. Though he was a young man, he had earned a reputation among his neighbors in St. Bride's as a hard worker. He had to be if he hoped to provide for his growing family. His wife Emily was pregnant, and he was determined his child would want for nothing. So Thomas fished, planted, cut firewood, and hunted as the seasons allowed. Of all his duties, hunting was his favorite. It didn't seem like work at all. He was a good shot, and fox, partridge, and caribou were plentiful. Rarely did he emerge from the woods without furs and fresh meat. It was a beautiful winter's day in St. Bride's. The sky was blue, and the snow crunched cleanly underfoot. Thomas would have liked nothing better than to spend the day in the woods. It was perfect weather for cutting and hauling firewood, but today he had other plans. He was going to deliver winter provisions to his father in Point Lance, some 20 kilometers away. Thomas readied his pony and sled, threw his gun over his shoulder, and set out. Fresh, unblemished snow covered the trail. Thomas wondered how long it had been since anyone had passed this way. Maybe a while. Winter was not the time for a long cross-country journey if it could be avoided. There were too many hazards, and the weather was too unforgiving. Lost in thought, Thomas rounded a bend. There, barely a stone's throw away, in a clearing on the edge of the road, was an impressive caribou, a black stag. He'd almost missed it. The pony halted immediately, flattening her ears. Instinctively, Thomas reached for his gun. This was too good an opportunity to miss. A chance for fresh meat in the dead of winter was never to be squandered. He raised the gun and took aim. With the stag so close, he couldn't miss. He fired. The sound of the shot reverberated through the trees, but nothing happened. He was sure he'd struck the stag, but the animal just stood there, uninjured and unconcerned. He couldn't believe it. Not since he was a boy had he missed such an easy shot. Fortunately, the animal hadn't bolted. Thomas hastily reloaded his gun and shot again. Once more he was sure he'd hit it, but all evidence was to the contrary. It hardly made sense. If nothing else, the stag should have been spooked, but it didn't appear the least bit concerned. The darkly beautiful animal remained in the clearing. So, for the third time, Thomas loaded the gun. He took 2 slow strides toward the stag, carefully aimed, and fired. He could not have missed. As he lowered the gun, Thomas kept his eyes on the animal. He waited for it to stumble, to fall to the snow. Instead, the stag slowly turned its head and gazed toward him. It had a look in its eye like Thomas had never seen. He couldn't explain it. It was as if the animal could see through him. The hair stood up on his neck. The shadows seemed to spill from the forest. Darkness surged like a wave across the white of the snow. Everything vanished. Everything but the stag and his horrible eyes. The only sound was the pounding of his heart. He needed to leave. He needed to put as much space between himself and the clearing as possible. Not wanting to provoke the stag, not knowing what it would do, Thomas backed carefully toward the sled. As soon as the reins were in his hands, the pony took off, as if she too were eager to leave the place. Faster and faster she galloped. They soared down the snowy road until the houses of Point Lance came into view. As Thomas pulled up outside his father's house, a group of men, mostly friends from Point Lance, came to greet him. As they helped unload the sled, Thomas told them of the stag, how close he was to it, and how it seemed immune to his shots. He didn't even try to explain how he felt when the stag looked at him. He knew he could never find the words. Still, the men could see he was troubled. They tried to lighten his mood. They teased him about his marksmanship. They said maybe his hunting days were past him. His father, trusting his son's aim, said the gunpowder must have gone damp. He might be right, thought Thomas. The story didn't make much sense. Still, his father hadn't seen the look in the stag's eyes. Winter days are short in Newfoundland, and the nights are long and dark. If Thomas hoped to travel home in daylight, he had no time to linger in Point Lance. The sun was already low in the sky. The pony trotted along the road to St. Bride's easily enough. Perhaps not as fast as usual, but that was understandable. She'd had little time to rest from her run earlier in the day. By the time they approached the clearing, the place where he'd seen the stag, it was dark. He could feel his apprehension growing. It was as if he were being watched, as if from every gap in the trees there might be eyes looking at him. His heart was racing. He wanted to get back to St. Bride's as fast as possible. He wanted to fly past the clearing, but the pony seemed to be losing steam. He urged her forward, but it was useless. She came to a stop. The clearing was dead ahead. Through the darkness, he couldn't see more than a few feet. The pony tossed her head back. Her eyes were wide, her nostrils flared. She stomped at the snow underfoot. Again he urged her forward, but she wouldn't budge. Thomas reached for his gun and powder horn. Then it happened. Back in St. Bride's, Emily peered from the kitchen window, hoping for some sign of her husband. It was long after dark, and it wasn't like Thomas to be so late. She checked the supper she'd been warming on the stove, when, from the corner of her eye, she caught sight of some motion. It was the pony. The animal was running straight for the house. It came to a stop right outside the door. She flew to it. The animal looked exhausted. Its harness was broken, and the sled was missing. Worst of all, there was no sign of Thomas. At dawn, the people of St. Bride's began a search. They followed the road toward Point Lance until they came to a clearing. There, on the road, they found Thomas, dead. His body had fallen across the sled. The contents of his powder horn were spilled across his face. The snow around the sled was undisturbed, and there was no sign of a struggle. Thomas seemed completely uninjured. What exactly happened to him was a mystery. As word of his death traveled, the men of Point Lance remembered the tale of the black stag. They remembered how apprehensive he seemed about the animal. Had Thomas fretted so badly over the stag that he frightened himself to death? But if that were true, what caused the pony to break free of its harness? Maybe it had been no ordinary stag. No one could say. A short time later, Emily gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Thomas in memory of his father. Emily, like many in St. Bride's, placed great faith in the church. She wanted to have her son properly christened as soon as possible. In those days, there were few clergy stationed along the coast. If she was going to have him blessed by a priest, she was going to have to take him from town. As soon as little Thomas was old enough to travel, Emily bundled him up for the journey. She was accompanied by Thomas' brother and a man who was boarding with them for the winter. The ground was still snow-covered, but they made good time crossing the country. They found the priest, and little Thomas was christened. It was the last time any of them were seen alive. The body of Emily and the baby were found on the road, not far from the clearing where Thomas had died. The baby was still cradled in Emily's arms, tucked deep into her chest, as if she were protecting him. The bodies of the men were found a short distance away. All were warmly dressed, and there were no marks on their bodies. The only clue was their footprints in the snow. It looked as though the travelers had been walking, then suddenly began to run, scattering in all directions. Whatever had caused them to run left no trace in the snow, but those who'd heard Thomas' story felt sure the Black Stag of St. Bride's had been there. And, for all anyone knows, it may be there still in the forest along Placentia Bay to this very day. The Black Stag is one of the classic ghost stories of Newfoundland and Labrador. The oldest version I'm aware of appeared in the Newfoundland Quarterly in December 1910 and is credited to James McGraw. In the preamble to the tale, the Newfoundland Quarterly notes, Mr. McGraw has heard this story so often that he believes it, as do many other residents of the Cape Shore. In the 114 years since Mr. McGraw shared the tale, it's been told again and again. In my retelling, I stayed pretty faithful to the core facts of Mr. McGraw's version, but I allowed myself to have some fun too and imagine what it might be like to encounter a spectral caribou on a dark, snowy road. I think it's an experience I'd like to keep strictly imaginary. The Black Stag got me thinking about other animal ghost stories. One that popped to mind was a tale from Elliston, where it said the ghost of a headless Newfoundland dog can be seen running toward the town each night. It said the dog was once the faithful companion of a man named Welcher. In the animal's mortal life, it was a working dog. It toiled alongside Welcher in his fishing enterprise. It hauled nets, fetched buoys, and pulled carts of cod. Welcher even took the animal to sea. Then, one tragic day, far from shore, the dog was killed. It wasn't just killed, it was decapitated. Some say it happened when the dog fell through some rapidly shifting ice. Others insist it died in a violent schooner wreck. Regardless, it didn't seem to want to stay dead. Some folks swear that every night, just after sunset, the headless specter of Welcher's dog can be seen racing towards Elliston, as if trying to return from sea, as if it's trying to come back home to the world of the living. I think if I were a kid in Elliston, I'd be home long before dark. As much as I love dogs, ghost dogs, no thank you. I was trying to think, I can't think of any other ghostly animals. The closest I can come up with is kind of a ghostly plant, I guess. I'm thinking of the mudsucker here. The mudsucker is a mysterious botanical creature, I guess, that lives beneath the surface of bogs, where it quietly waits for hapless visitors. When they venture too close, the creature strikes and sucks the interloper into the bog. Now you may think you've never seen a mudsucker, but you can't be sure. The only part of the creature visible above the bog is the pitcher plant, the marsh-loving and legitimately carnivorous provincial flower of Newfoundland and Labrador. If you've got any more stories of creepy plants or animals from Newfoundland and Labrador, I'd love to hear them. The comments here are always open. You can also reach me at productofnewfoundland.ca. All my contact info and socials are there. You'll also find more creepy stories and curated playlists of Halloweenish music from local artists. Check it out. Stay tuned for more Halloween episodes before the end of October. Plus, Season 3 of Strange Truths and Tall Tales is coming soon. I've got some pretty exciting guests lined up. Can't wait to tell you about those. In the meantime, stay on well-marked paths. Maybe turn your jacket inside out. And a little bread in your pocket probably wouldn't hurt. I really would like to see you guys again. If none of that makes sense to you, you're clearly not a product of Newfoundland.